Within 6 hours of Marcus Cole surfacing from his dive, the coordinates of the alien ship had been transmitted to every major government on Earth, and the quiet stretch of ocean above the Discovery became the most crowded place on the planet. Naval vessels from Australia arrived first, followed quickly by American destroyers and Chinese frigates and European research ships, all of them circling the location like sharks around a wounded fish, and the sky filled with helicopters and drones capturing footage that would soon spread across every television and computer screen in the world. Marcus sat in a small room aboard an Australian naval command ship, wrapped in a blanket and drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, answering the same questions over and over again for men and women in uniforms, covered with medals and badges that meant nothing to him. "Tell us again what you saw inside," demanded an American admiral whose name Marcus had already forgotten. And Marcus closed his eyes and described the corridor and the lights, and the star map and the countdown for what felt like the 100th time. The countdown now showed less than 60 hours remaining. Daiyuki Tanaka arrived on the second day, flown in from a university in Tokyo, where she had spent her career studying something called xenolinguistics, which Marcus learned was the study of how humans might communicate with alien species if they ever encountered them. She was a small woman with gray hair and bright eyes that sparkled with excitement, rather than the fear that seemed to grip everyone else. And when she shook Marcus's hand, she laughed with pure joy and said that this was the moment she had spent her entire life preparing for. "You have to take me down there," she told the admirals and generals who were arguing about what to do next, "because that countdown is still running, and we need to understand what it means before it reaches zero." The military commanders did not want to send anyone back into the ship, afraid of what might happen. But Dr. Tanaka argued that ignoring the vessel would not make it go away. And eventually, they agreed to send a team of divers back down with Dr. Tanaka and Marcus as guides. Marcus did not want to go back into that ship, but when Dr. Tanaka looked at him with those excited eyes and asked if he would show her what he had found, he could not say no, because someone had to be brave, and it might as well be him. They descended together, a team of 12 divers plus Dr. Tanaka in a specialized suit. And when they entered the ship, the lights activated just as they had before, welcoming them into the dry interior as if they were expected guests. The central chamber looked the same, with the star map still floating above the pedestal. But this time, Dr. Tanaka walked straight up to it and began speaking in slow, clear words. "We are humans," she said. "We come from the planet you have marked on this map, and we wish to communicate with whoever left this message." For a long moment, nothing happened, and Marcus began to think that Dr. Tanaka's methods were foolish. But then the air above the pedestal shimmered, and a new projection appeared, showing symbols and patterns that began to shift and change as the ship's systems analyzed Dr. Tanaka's speech. "It is learning our language," Dr. Tanaka whispered with wonder in her voice. "The computer is still active after all this time, and it is trying to talk to us." Over the next several hours, while the countdown continued to tick down above them, Dr. Tanaka worked with the alien computer, feeding it words and concepts and watching as it built a translation matrix that grew more sophisticated with every passing minute. By the time the countdown showed 40 hours remaining, the computer could form simple sentences in English, and Dr. Tanaka began asking questions that made Marcus's head spin with their implications. The ship belonged to a species called the Kethari. The computer explained in a voice that sounded like wind chimes and distant thunder. And they had visited Earth 65 million years ago as part of a program to monitor developing worlds across the galaxy. 65 million years, Marcus repeated, his voice barely a whisper. That was when the dinosaurs died. The Kethari had watched Earth for millions of years before then. The computer continued, recording observations about the life forms that emerged and evolved and sometimes went extinct. And they had paid special attention to one species of ape that showed unusual potential. "You watched us," Dr. Tanaka said. "You watched humans evolve from the very beginning." The computer confirmed this with a pulse of blue light. And then it revealed that the ship contained an archive. A complete record of everything the Cathari had observed during their time watching Earth, including 300,000 years of detailed observations about humanity. "Why did you leave this archive here?" Dr. Tanaka asked, and the computer's response made the blood drain from her face. The Cathari had fled from something they called the Hollow, a force that consumed spacefaring civilizations and left nothing behind. And they had hidden archives like this one on promising worlds throughout the galaxy as a warning and a hope. "The countdown," Marcus interrupted. "What happens when it reaches 0? The computer explained that the countdown was a beacon activated when the archive was accessed, designed to signal the Cathari's successors that someone had found the ship and might be ready to receive its contents. "So something is coming," Dr. Tanaka said. "Something will receive that signal and come here to find out who triggered it." The computer could not tell them who or what would respond to the beacon, because the Cathari had been gone for 65 million years and much had changed in the galaxy since then. But it offered them something that might help them prepare. "I will give you access to the archive," the computer said, "so you can see what the Cathari learned about your species and why they believed you were special." The holographic display changed, showing file after file of observations and recordings and analysis. And as Dr. Tanaka began to read the translated text, her hands started to shake and tears formed in her eyes. "Marcus," she said in a voice thick with emotion, "you need to see this. Everyone needs to see this. Because the Cathari did not just watch us. They studied us for thousands of centuries, and what they concluded about humanity changes everything." The countdown showed 36 hours remaining. And somewhere out among the stars, something was already on its way to answer the signal. But in that moment, all Marcus could think about was the words floating in the air before him. Words written by aliens millions of years ago about a species of stubborn, persistent, impossible apes who refused to die no matter what the universe threw at them. Humanity had been tested, and according to the Cathari, humanity had passed. Marcus Cole checked his diving equipment one more time as the research vessel rocked gently on the waves of the Coral Sea, and the morning sun painted the water in shades of gold and blue that made him remember why he had fallen in love with the ocean all those years ago. He had been a salvage diver for 15 years. Working out of Darwin and taking jobs that other divers refused because the depths were too great or the risks too high. But this job was different in ways he could not explain, and the feeling in his gut told him that something was waiting for him down there in the dark water below. The company that hired him was called Meridian Oceanic Research, and they had offered him triple his normal rate just to investigate a sonar anomaly 200 kilometers off the Queensland coast, which was strange because sonar anomalies were usually nothing special, just old shipwrecks or rock formations or garbage dumped by careless ships decades ago. "You ready to go down there?" asked Captain Sarah Webb from the deck above him, a voice carrying that mix of concern and curiosity that Marcus had heard from many people when they looked at the sonar readings. "Ready as I will ever be," Marcus replied as he pulled his mask over his face and checked his air supply one final time, feeling the weight of the equipment on his back and the familiar pressure of anticipation in his chest. He dropped backward off the boat and into the warm water, and immediately the world above vanished as he began his descent into the blue darkness that stretched endlessly below him, with sunlight filtering through the water and beautiful rays that grew dimmer with every meter he sank. At 30 meters, the water grew colder and the light began to fade, and Marcus switched on his underwater torch, watching the beam cut through the darkness like a knife through cloth. revealing small fish that darted away from the sudden brightness. At 60 meters, he could see the seafloor beginning to take shape below him. A landscape of sand and rock and coral that looked like an alien world, even though he had seen it hundreds of times before. And his instruments told him he was getting close to the anomaly. At 90 meters, Marcus stopped swimming and simply stared, because what lay before him was impossible. Absolutely and completely impossible, and yet there it was. A ship sat half buried in the sand, but it was no ship that human hands had ever built. And Marcus knew this with complete certainty because the vessel was smooth and black and shaped like nothing he had ever seen in any maritime museum or shipyard or military catalog. The hull curved in organic shapes that reminded him of a whale or a giant squid. And there were no rivets or seams or welding marks anywhere on its surface, as if the entire ship had been grown rather than built. And the most disturbing thing was that there was no corrosion or barnacles or any sign of decay, despite the sediment piled around it suggesting it had been here for a very long time. Marcus swam closer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. And his torch beam moved across the strange surface as he searched for any identifying marks or symbols or anything that might explain what he was looking at. Then he found the opening, and it was not a hole or a breach, but what could only be a doorway. Perfectly shaped and perfectly smooth. And as Marcus floated in front of it, he could have sworn that something inside the ship was watching him. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of diving screamed at him to surface immediately, to swim back to the boat and radio for help, and let someone else deal with this impossible discovery. But another part of him knew that if he left now, he would never know what was inside, and that question would haunt him for the rest of his life. He swam through the doorway. The moment he crossed the threshold, lights flickered on throughout the interior of the ship. Soft blue lights that illuminated a corridor stretching deeper into the vessel. And Marcus realized with a shock that made him gasp into his regulator that the ship had recognized his presence and responded to it. The corridor was dry, somehow sealed against the ocean outside. And Marcus found himself in an air pocket that should not exist, breathing real oxygen that tasted clean and fresh despite being trapped inside this vessel for what might have been centuries or millennia. He removed his mask and took a cautious breath, then another. And when he did not die, he began walking deeper into the ship, his diving fins making soft sounds on the smooth floor as the lights continued to activate ahead of him, guiding him forward like a welcome guest. The central chamber was round and vast, with walls that curved upward into a dome. And in the center stood a pedestal that hummed with energy Marcus could feel in his bones. And above the pedestal floated a holographic projection that made his knees go weak. It was a star map, and Marcus recognized the familiar spiral of the Milky Way galaxy, with one small dot highlighted in blue near one of the spiral arms. And he knew without being told that the blue dot was Earth, his home, the planet he had left just 90 meters above his head. But it was the numbers floating beside the projection that filled him with a fear he had never known before, because they were counting down, and even though he could not read the alien symbols, he somehow understood their meaning. 72 hours. Something was coming, and Marcus Cole, a simple salvage diver from Darwin who had just wanted to earn some extra money, had just announced to someone or something out there among the stars that humanity existed and could be found. He ran back through the corridor, dove through the doorway, and swam toward the surface faster than safety protocols allowed, because the world needed to know what he had found, and they had less than 3 days to figure out what to do about it. The sunlight hit his face as he broke the surface, and Captain Webb was already shouting questions at him. But Marcus could only say one thing as he grabbed the ladder and pulled himself onto the deck with shaking arms. "Call everyone," he gasped, water streaming down his face and his eyes wide with terror and wonder. Call the Navy and the government and the scientists and anyone who will listen. Because everything we thought we knew about being alone in the universe just changed forever. The archive contained more information than all the libraries on Earth combined. And as Dr. Tanaka worked through the night to translate its contents, scientists and world leaders gathered aboard the command ship above to hear what the Cathari had written about the human race. Marcus sat in the corner of the conference room, forgotten by the important people in their expensive suits and military uniforms, but he listened to every word that Dr. Tanaka spoke. And with each new revelation, he felt something strange growing in his chest, something that might have been pride. The Cathari observed over 10,000 species across the galaxy. Dr. Tanaka began, her voice carrying through speakers to hundreds of other ships and millions of viewers watching live broadcasts around the world. And they developed a system for predicting which species would survive and which would go extinct. She pulled up a holographic display showing charts and graphs filled with alien symbols that her translation software converted to English. And the numbers made several of the scientists in the room gasp with disbelief. According to their models, humans should have gone extinct 17 times. Dr. Tanaka continued, 17 separate events that their calculations said would end our species, and yet here we are. The first predicted extinction was an ice age 70,000 years ago, when the human population dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals, and they Cathari wrote that recovery was statistically impossible. But somehow those 10,000 survivors held on and rebuilt. The second was a volcanic winter caused by a massive eruption. And the third was a drought that lasted decades. And the fourth was a plague that swept through early civilizations. And on the list went. Disaster after disaster that should have ended humanity, but did not. They call us an anomaly, Dr. Tanaka said with a smile that made her look 20 years younger. They could not explain how we kept surviving when every other species they observed would have failed under the same conditions. She read from the archive, her voice filled with wonder as she spoke the words that alien observers had written about humanity thousands of years before the first human city was built. Subject species demonstrates unprecedented adaptability, they wrote. Survivability index exceeds all predictive models by a factor of 7, and recommend continued observation to understand the mechanism behind this resilience. Marcus thought about all the stories he had heard growing up. Stories of people surviving impossible situations through stubbornness and hope and sheer refusal to give up. And he realized that those stories were not exceptions, but examples of something fundamental to human nature. The next section of the archive focused on human behavior, and this was where the Cathari observations became truly fascinating, because they could not understand why humans did many of the things they did. They mourn their dead, Dr. Tanaka read. They create art and music that serves no survival function. They tell stories about things that do not exist. They form bonds with other species and treat them as family members. And they will sacrifice their own lives to save strangers they have never met. The Cathari had watched humans for 300,000 years, and they still could not explain these behaviors using their models. So they had created a special classification for humanity that appeared nowhere else in their records. Classification: anomalous, Dr. Tanaka announced. Recommended action: do not interfere, observe only, because this species may develop in ways we cannot predict. A general from America stood up and asked the question that everyone was thinking, wondering why the Cathari had cared so much about one species of ape on one small planet in one corner of the galaxy. Dr. Tanaka's expression grew serious as she moved to the final section of the archive, the part that explained why the Cathari had left their records behind and why humanity mattered to them. The Cathari were running from something, she explained, a force they called the Hollow, that consumed spacefaring civilizations and left nothing behind. And they knew they could not escape it forever. The archive described the hollow in terms that made even the bravest soldiers in the room go pale. A darkness that spread from star to star and devoured everything in its path. And the Cathari had watched it destroy hundreds of species more advanced than humanity. They left archives on worlds they thought might produce survivors, Dr. Tanaka continued. Worlds with species that might one day develop the technology to fight back against the hollow. And Earth was one of those worlds. She pulled up the final entry in the archive. The last words the Cathari had written before abandoning their observation post and fleeing into the dark spaces between galaxies. And Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as she read them aloud. "We've watched this species called humanity for longer than they can imagine," Dr. Tanaka read, her voice cracking with emotion. "And we have seen them survive what should have killed them again and again. And we have seen them do things that make no logical sense, but that somehow make them stronger. We do not know if any species can survive what is coming. But our models suggest that if any species has a chance, it is these humans. Because they possess something we have never observed before. Something we do not have a word for in our language. They do not know when to die. And perhaps that is exactly what the universe needs." The room was silent as Dr. Tanaka finished reading, and Marcus looked around at the faces of the most powerful people on Earth, seeing the same mix of fear and hope that he felt in his own heart. The countdown showed 12 hours remaining, and somewhere out in the darkness of space, something was coming to answer the signal, and humanity had less than half a day to decide what they would say when it arrived. But for the first time since Marcus had discovered the ship, he felt something other than fear. Because now he knew that humanity had faced impossible odds before and won. And maybe, just maybe, they could do it again. The countdown reached 0 at exactly 3:17 in the afternoon, Australian Eastern Time. And every person on Earth who had access to a television or computer or phone watched as a pulse of blue light erupted from the ocean and shot into the sky like a spear thrown at the stars. Marcus stood on the deck of the command ship, shielding his eyes from the brightness. And he felt the signal pass through him like a wave of electricity that made his teeth tingle and his hair stand on end. And then it was gone, racing away from Earth at speeds that human science said were impossible. The world held its breath. Governments activated their military forces and pointed every weapon they had at the sky. And people filled churches and temples and mosques to pray for protection. And scientists aimed their telescopes and radio dishes at the heavens, searching for any sign of a response. 3 days passed and nothing happened. And some people began to hope that maybe the signal had gone unanswered, that maybe whoever the Cathari had expected to receive, it was long dead or too far away to care. Then on the morning of the 4th day, every satellite in orbit detected something entering the solar system at incredible speed. And within hours the object was close enough to see. A single ship that glowed with soft silver light as it slowed and approached Earth. The ship was beautiful in a way that made human vessels look like toys. Smooth and graceful and alive with energy that pulsed along its hull like a heartbeat. And it was huge, larger than any aircraft carrier or cruise ship that humans had ever built. It did not attack. It did not broadcast threats or demands. It simply descended through the atmosphere, ignoring the fighter jets that scrambled to intercept it, and landed in the red desert of the Australian outback, settling onto the sand without making a sound, and then it waited. Every camera in the world pointed at that silver ship, and every human being watched their screens and wondered what would happen next. And Marcus Cole found himself on a helicopter flying toward the landing site because someone had decided that the man who found the archive should be present. When he met its makers or its destroyers. The ship opened. A ramp extended from the hull to the desert floor, and figures emerged. walking down into the sunlight for the first time. And Marcus stared at them with a mix of terror and wonder that made his legs feel weak beneath him. They were tall and slender, with skin that shifted colors like oil on water. And their faces were almost human, but not quite, with larger eyes and smaller mouths and expressions that were impossible to read. And they moved with a grace that made humans look clumsy by comparison. The leader of the aliens stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked at the crowd of soldiers and scientists and politicians who had gathered to meet them. And when it spoke, its voice was like music that somehow formed words in perfect English. "We are the Valith," the alien said, "inheritors of the space that the Kethari once protected, and we have traveled far to answer the signal from your world." A general from America stepped forward, his hand on his weapon, and demanded to know if the aliens came in peace or if they intended to conquer Earth. And the Valith made a sound that might have been laughter. "We did not come to conquer," the alien replied. "We came because we received your signal and accessed the archive remotely. And we read what the Kethari wrote about your species, and we have a question we wish to ask." The general looked confused, and the other humans exchanged nervous glances, because they had expected threats or ultimatums or demands for surrender, not questions. "The Hollow has taken 900 civilizations," the Valith continued, and its voice carried a weight of sadness that made Marcus want to weep. "We have run from it for 10,000 years, moving from system to system as it consumed everything behind us, and we are tired. The Kethari believed that your species was different, that you possess something that other species lacked, something that might allow you to stand against the darkness when everyone else fled, and we wish to know if they were right." The alien looked directly at Marcus, who had somehow ended up at the front of the crowd without realizing it, and its shifting eyes seemed to see straight into his soul. "Will you help us fight?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing, and Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down on him. Because this was not a question for one man, but for all of humanity. And yet here he was, standing before an alien species that had crossed the galaxy to ask for help. He thought about the archive, about the Kethari records that described humanity as anomalous, as survivors, as a species that did not know when to die. And he thought about all the times in history when humans had faced impossible odds and refused to give up. But he was just a diver, a working man who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself, and he did not have the authority to speak for his entire species. "I cannot answer for everyone," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear that made his hands tremble. "But I can tell you that humans have never been good at running from things that scare us. And if there is a way to fight this hollow of yours, there will be people willing to try." The Valith made that musical sound again, and this time Marcus was certain it was laughter, warm and genuine, and filled with something that might have been hope. "Then perhaps the Kethari were right about your kind," the alien said. "Perhaps you really are different from all the others, and perhaps the universe still has a chance." Behind them, the cameras broadcast every word to billions of viewers around the world. And the question that the Valith had asked began to spread across every nation and every culture, sparking debates and arguments and discussions that would determine the fate of humanity. "Will you help us fight?" The answer would come, but it would not come from governments or generals or scientists in fancy laboratories. It would come from ordinary people, from workers and teachers and parents and children, from every corner of Earth where humans looked up at the stars and decided whether they would run from the darkness or stand against it. The world erupted into chaos after the Valith asked their question, with governments arguing and populations dividing and fear spreading like wildfire across every continent on Earth. Some nations wanted to hide, to pretend the aliens had never come and hoped that the hollow would pass them by. And some wanted to seize the alien technology by force. And some refused to believe any of it was real despite the evidence floating in the skies above them. Marcus watched the debates unfold on television screens aboard the command ship, and he felt a growing frustration in his chest. Because while politicians argued and generals planned and diplomats negotiated, the Violith waited patiently in the desert, their questions still unanswered. 1 week after the landing, Marcus asked to speak with the Vilith ambassador again, and to his surprise, the request was granted, and he found himself walking alone across the red sand toward the silver ship that had become the most famous image on Earth. The ambassador emerged to meet him, its skin shifting through colors that Marcus had learned to recognize as curiosity and interest. And they stood together in the shade of the great vessel as the sun beat down on the desert around them. "You have a question," the Vilith said, because it had learned to read human expressions in the days since its arrival. "Please ask it." Marcus took a deep breath and spoke the words that had been burning in his mind since the first moment he heard the alien's request. "Why us?" he asked. "You have ships that can cross galaxies, technology that makes ours look like stone tools, knowledge gathered over thousands of years. So why do you need humans to help you fight?" The Vilith was silent for a long moment, and its colors shifted to something Marcus had not seen before, a deep blue mixed with silver that seemed to pulse with emotion. "Because we learned to run," the alien finally replied. 10,000 years ago, when the Hollow first appeared in our home system, we had a choice to make, and we chose to flee. And we have been running ever since. Every world we settled became temporary. Every relationship we formed ended in abandonment. Every generation of our people grew up knowing that someday they would have to leave everything behind. And over time we forgot what it meant to stand and fight. Marcus thought about human history, about all the wars and conflicts and struggles that had shaped his species. And he realized that humans had never had the option of running, because there had always been nowhere else to go. "We have read the Kethari archives," the Vilith continued, "and we have seen how your species fights against impossible odds, how you refuse to surrender even when logic says you have already lost, how you will sacrifice everything to protect what you love. We have forgotten how to do that, and we hoped that you could teach us." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he understood for the first time why the Vilith had traveled so far and asked so much, because they were not looking for weapons or soldiers or strategic advantages. They were looking for hope. Marcus returned to the command ship with a new determination burning in his heart, and he demanded to speak before the assembled leaders of Earth. And because he had become famous as the man who found the archive, they agreed to listen. "You are asking the wrong question," he told the presidents and prime ministers and generals who watched him with skeptical eyes. "You keep asking whether we should help the Vilith, but that is not the choice in front of us. The choice is whether we want to be the species that Kethari believed we were. The survivors, the fighters, the ones who do not know when to die, or whether we want to hide in the dark and hope the Hollow does not find us." His words spread across the world through the cameras that broadcast the meeting, and something began to change in the hearts of ordinary people everywhere. A scientist in Japan published her research freely on the internet, sharing everything she knew about alien technology because she believed knowledge should not be hoarded when the stakes were so high. A factory worker in Germany volunteered to help build whatever ships or weapons humanity would need, working extra hours without pay because he wanted to do something that mattered. A teacher in Brazil told her students about the Kethari archives and watched their eyes light up with wonder and determination as they realized that humanity had been preparing for this moment for 300,000 years. Soldiers from nations that had been enemies for generations began talking to each other, sharing strategies and experiences, and learning to trust people they had been taught to hate. Because the Hollow did not care about borders or politics or old grudges. The decision was not made by any government or any vote or any official declaration. It was made by millions of individual humans who looked at the choice before them and decided that running was not an option. That if the darkness was coming, they would rather face it standing up than hiding in the shadows. 3 months after the Valith landed in Australia, Marcus Cole stood in a crowd of 10,000 volunteers at a hastily built spaceport in the outback, watching as the first joint human Valith vessel rose into the sky. The ship was not as beautiful as the alien craft, still rough around the edges with human welding marks visible on its hull, but it flew. And it carried humans and aliens together into the stars for the first time in history. Dear Tanaka stood beside him, her eyes wet with tears as she watched the ship disappear into the blue, and she squeezed his hand and smiled. The Cathari would be proud, she said. They waited 65 million years for someone to find their archive, and look what happened. Marcus thought about the day he had dropped into the water and swum down to investigate a sonar anomaly, never imagining that his life would change so completely. And he realized that humanity had been swimming toward this moment for their entire existence. The Valith ambassador approached them, its colors bright with an emotion that Marcus had learned to recognize as joy, and it placed one long hand on his shoulder. "We asked if you would help us fight," the alien said. "And your people answered in ways we never expected, not with armies or weapons, but with something far more powerful." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "You gave us hope," the Valith replied. "You reminded us what it means to stand for something instead of running from everything. And for the first time in 10,000 years, my people believe we might actually survive." Marcus watched another ship rise into the sky, carrying more volunteers toward the stars, and he thought about the Cathari words that had changed everything. They do not know when to die. The Cathari had been right, and now the galaxy was about to find out what happened when a species that refused to surrender met a darkness that had never been challenged. The hollow was still out there, spreading across the stars and consuming everything in its path, but for the first time in millennia, it would face something new. Humanity was coming, and they were bringing their stubborn, impossible, anomalous refusal to give up with them. The stars had never seen anything like humans before, and Marcus smiled as he realized that the universe was about to learn why that mattered.